Welcome to Inside the Progressive Prosecutors Movement and Assessment. I'm Elena Eisenstadt, a second-year history and Spanish major from Philadelphia. I'm also an editor and reporter at the Chicago Maroon. Our first panelist, Chesa Boudin, is the former district attorney of San Francisco and the founding executive director of the Criminal Law and Justice Center at the Berkeley School of Law. Boudin was raised in Hyde Park and attended University of Chicago Lab School after his parents were imprisoned in connection with the Weather Underground. In office, Boudin promoted decarceration and instituted policies to increase police accountability. Our second panelist, Kim Foxx, is in her second term as District Attorney of Cook County. She is a lifelong Chicagoan who grew up in the Cabrini Green housing projects on the near North Side. In office, Foxx has supported the abolition of cash bail in Illinois, which became the first state to do so in 2023. She has also helped to reverse over 200 convictions from misconduct allegations. Our third panelist, Wesley Bell, became St. Louis's first Black county prosecutor in 2019 and is currently running in Missouri's first congressional district election. He was raised by a police officer and county civil servant in northern St. Louis. In office, Bell has established community-based policing programs and expanded diversion programs for low-level offenders. Our moderator, Emily Bazelon, is a senior research fellow at Yale Law School and New York Times Magazine staff writer. In 2019, she published the award-winning book, Charged, the new movement to transform American prosecution and end mass incarceration. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. During the event, someone will place a microphone in the audience when it is time for Q&A. Please line up, and as usual, we give priority for the first questions to students. The next two Speaker Series events will be Better Elections, Better Politics on Thursday, January 18th, and Meet the Winter Spring 2024 Pritzker Fellows on Tuesday, January 23rd. The events will take place here at Ida Noyes Hall and run from 5:30 p.m. to 6:45 p.m. I encourage everyone to visit the IOP's website for more information on future Speaker Series events and opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Now, please welcome panelists Chesa Boudin, Kim Foxx, and Wesley Bell with moderator Emily Bazelon.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being with us on what to me at least seems like a very chilly evening. I feel so privileged to be on stage with three former public officials who have had a really daunting and in a lot of ways thankless task. They have devoted themselves to trying to make the criminal legal system better, to try to produce better outcomes for their communities in a world in which, in a lot of ways, making this particular system better is a Sisyphean challenge. I know all these folks' work from the book that I wrote, and when I published this book about the power of prosecutors and the movement to end mass incarceration, it was 2019, and crime was falling, and it was kind of the beginning of this movement, and it was a much easier time in a lot of ways to talk about these issues. I kind of got an easy ride, because it seemed all very win-win. We are a few years older, if not wiser at this point. And since that time, the country went through the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, a huge protest movement to try, I think, in a lot of ways to further the goals that some of you have. And then after that, a rise in violent crime, or in some ways, in some places, a perceived rise, and a lot of political difficulties that came out of that. So what I wanted to start by asking each of you is how you see, at this point, the goals and the messaging of this movement for justice that you're part of. What do you emphasize? What do you see as your priorities or the priorities of the movement now? Kim, maybe we'll start with you, just because you're sitting next to me.
Sure. So, I've had the privilege of knowing Emily for a few years, right when I first began this work 7 years ago. And there was not, so I bristle sometimes at the notion of a movement. Right? When I ran for this office back in 2016, there was no progressive prosecutor movement. I think I should be very, very blunt with that. The nomenclature around this is relatively new. I ran because I was an assistant state's attorney in this office for a dozen years. I also grew up in this city. I knew people who had been impacted by the criminal legal system. I myself had been a victim of crime. And I saw a system that, you know, as a victim and someone who had worked in it, kind of churn. It was a churn. And all in the name of keeping communities safe, but the neighborhood that I grew up in had a high level of violence, a high level of incarceration, and the things that were driving violence in our communities weren't being addressed. So I ran on to do something about that, to keep our community safe in a way that did not have a disproportionate impact on communities like the one that I grew up in. And so it was relatively novel in 2015, 2016 to run for office talking about police accountability. We'd had the murder of Laquan McDonald, 17-year-old who was shot 16 times and what appeared to be a cover-up, and a prosecutor who failed to act in a timely manner. You had activists and advocates who were paying attention to this role for the with real intensity for the first time in a really long time, despite a history here in Chicago and Cook of a criminal legal system rife with misconduct and abuse and torture. And so as a prosecutor, I raised these issues. We talked about John Burge. We talked about Ronald Watts. We talked about Laquan McDonald, and the public voted for it. I have to remind people, especially here at home, for those of you who are seeing me for the first time, I'm not self-anointed. I won overwhelmingly in 2016 on a platform of reform. And I was reelected in 2020 on the same platform. And so I think it's important that when we talk about what does the movement look like, it really was powered by people and the expectations of people who live in community of what their justice system should look like. And in 2016, when I came into office, by the way, that was the bloodiest year we'd seen in Chicago since 1999. So I took office in a year where we were seeing at that time historic levels of violence, and the public said, even with the violence that we're seeing, we want a criminal justice system that we can have faith in. Where we are today, a mere 7 years later, prosecutors across the country running on similar platforms, a rise, and as you say, a perceived rise in violent crime in certain areas, a narrative that has taken hold, real fear that people feel about their safety, and what has become, I think, an oversimplification and a dumbing down of a really complex issue. I wish I could be more elegant than that. We've just decided to revert. We've just decided that these big complex issues around crime and violence are the singular fault of someone sitting on this stage and not the historical disinvestments in communities that are impacted by violence. We've decided that it must be these prosecutors. And I have to remind people, I saw a well-noted journalist, and I'll shut up, a well-known journalist write an op-ed in the Chicago Sun-Times a few weeks ago. And he said, I've 30 years or 35 years in journalism, I've never seen crime like this before. I lived in this city my entire life. We had homicide rates in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that make where we are pale in comparison. This is not where we ought to be either. But we also cannot engage in disingenuous conversations about violence and crime and then allow for that to be a scapegoating of those who've asked for something different. And again, as someone who's not been self-anointed, the people have asked for something different. And I would certainly hope that as I leave office and new folks take in, that we don't succumb to trying to satisfy people's thirst for a quick answer and delve into the complexities of what we've tried to do on this stage.
So, Wes, how do you talk about your work in a way that tries to surmount these barriers?
First and foremost, I do want to thank the university for hosting us, and the Institute of Politics, and for the work that you've done. We've been able to do a lot. I've been able to do a lot with with this particular university. And these are conversations that are so important. So thank you for hosting us, but also thank you all for being here. You all, I can't really tell because this light is shining on me, so I trust that you get the message too. But I think that in addition to everything that DA Foxx said, which I agree with, is that messaging, that narrative is important, because as soon as we get in the office in these types of spaces, we're immediately going to be are labeled as, you just want to let everybody out. You don't care about public safety. And I think that our argument, and now I think we have the data to back it up, is that no, actually our argument moves forward the idea of public safety and makes us more safe. I had the privilege of coming in on the heels of some of the original DAs in the movement, that being one of those being Kim Foxx. And so although I'm fairly early in the movement myself, I still wasn't starting from scratch. I got to sit in her office, and I came up as soon as I was elected with members of my team, and she opened her doors up, and I just got to be the annoying little brother asking all these annoying questions. And she answered all those questions, and it was invaluable to me, because I got to ask her, well, what are the things you did right? What are the things you wish you could do better? And she didn't get that opportunity, but I did, and it helped us create a model that worked for us in St. Louis County. And part of that model was talking about how important it is to expand treatment programs and how that ties in to public safety, but also remembering that our communities in particular are impacted by serious and violent crimes. And we don't have to shy away from saying, hey, we're also going to prosecute those cases to keep you safe. We can do both. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can do both. And what I'm really proud of is with our diversion programs, in less than 4 years, over 2,200 people who would have seen the inside of a jail, not only didn't see the inside of a jail, but with a 92% success rate, 95% success rate, and 5.9% recidivism rate for those individuals that we were able to connect to treatment as opposed to sending them to jail. And I think those are the kind of stories we got to continue to talk about.
So Wes is bringing in data in a skillful way, good illustration. Chesa, is data enough?
Well, first of all, let me say it has been about 25 years since I've been in this building. And I used to come here all the time. I grew up in the neighborhood. I used to watch movies downstairs, come on dates, whatever it was. And it is great to be back. But I blame Kim for the bad weather.
Does this count as bad weather?
Oh my
Seems
God.
like
No,
the
this ain't
winter.
good. This ain't good.
Okay.
You know what? I've been in California too long, and I cannot handle the Chicago winters anymore. But I'm glad that you all braved the weather to come and join us. I see some familiar faces in the audience. I appreciate you all coming out and listening to the stories and to the data. To Emily's question, one of the lessons that I learned the hard way in office was that on some level, data doesn't matter to a lot of people, and that's a disappointing message to learn for somebody who cares, for any of us who care about integrity, honesty, facts, evidence, good public policy. But over and over and over again, when I was in office, I would go to town halls, I would go to community meetings, I would go to Merchant Association board meetings, I would go to public safety events with the chief of police or a local precinct captain, and people would say that they felt unsafe. And for the first year or so that I was in office, I would say, well, let's look at the data and talk about it. And I would show data that ultimately in my 2.5 years in office, overall crime fell by more than 20%. And that's true for both violent crime and nonviolent crime. Let me say it again. Overall crime fell by more than 20%, and they recalled me for the first time in San Francisco's history. Data had nothing to do with it. It was not about data. Nobody wanted to hear that crime was down. And I learned eventually, I probably should have been calling Kim the way Wesley did earlier in my administration, might not have made these mistakes, that you can't go as an elected official into a town hall with people who show up at a public safety meeting because they are scared or because they have been a victim and show them statistics and pie charts. It doesn't matter to them. But it does have to matter when we're making public policy. It does have to matter when we're implementing decisions in government. The elected official, which I am no longer one of, has to show up and say to that person, I am so sorry for what happened to you, and let me tell you what we're going to do about it. And it has to be somebody else's job, right? Jamie Calvin and the Invisible Institute. Those of you here in the university who are professors, those of you working in the MacArthur Justice Center, those of you running for office who have to speak truth to power. It has to be those of you in those roles wearing those hats who set the record straight. We cannot ask our elected officials. They can do a lot of things for us, but it cannot be their job to correct every misconception about how the system works. I tried to do that. I was earnest. I was honest. I believed that San Francisco voters were the most well-educated voters anywhere in the country, and that data and science and reason would prevail.
So one way to think about this is that one way to think about this is that there's what you do and the way in which that has to be data driven. And then there's how you talk about what you do, which has to probably go beyond data. Kim, I know this is something that you have thought about because you are incredibly good at telegraphing empathy. And I just wonder if you can tell the audience a little bit about how, is that something that you always did kind of from the beginning of your work as a politician? Did you have some moment where you realized you were going to need to bring your own story to the community and to your voters?
I mean, my story was why I got in the role in the first place. Like I have been, I think, incredibly transparent about my journey in this city. And it was, what I wear very close to the surface is that I had every criminogenic risk factor to end up in the criminal justice system. Single parent household, public housing, a survivor of childhood sexual assault, concentrated poverty. Like there's a list that they go down of who's likely to end up and is a victim or a defendant. I had every criminogenic factor to be here, just not as the top prosecutor. Most people who have those factors end up behind bars or have been hurt. They don't sit in a position of policy. And so when I ran, it was really important to say ad nauseum where I came from. Like I don't talk about being from Cabrini Green for like street cred. I talk about it because we lose so many people in neighborhoods just like the one that I grew up in, and we don't invest in what it helps that because we don't see their humanity. A lot of this is about humanity. And you know, I say this, I'm going to say it a lot between now and 11:59, November 30th of this year. I'm out, y'all. So I have nothing to lose in these conversations. And I think part of being an elected official is the measuring of our words, to Chesa's point, you know, that there's a measuring of how much can people handle. And the reality is, particularly around crime and violence, particularly in a city like Chicago, where we're so racially segregated, for a really long time, there were acceptable places where violence could happen. There were acceptable victims of violence that we could open the paper and look on Mondays. It's almost like a scorecard, right? How many shot, how many died? It leads on the crawl every day in the morning. How many shot, how many died? These are actual people. And so my empathy and humanity is, what would have happened if someone like me had died or gone to prison? What are we losing in these conversations when we aren't talking about like what this really means? So when Chesa talks about the data, that for every homicide, that is a person, a community, a school, a future, we're all impacted. And so I think it's really important, and I think for a lot of elected officials, and particularly in roles like these, historically when people ran for these jobs, they didn't talk about the humanity of the people. They pounded a table and they said, I'm gonna be tough. And the data matters because it was like, well, how do we know that your toughness worked? We had really tough on crime prosecutors in the 80s and 900 people murdered every year. We had people who would say, I'm gonna hold them accountable, I'm pushing for the death penalty, all these things. And we had homicide rates that make today, we pale in comparison. And so I don't wanna talk about rhetoric and toughness. There are people attached to this. And part of the reason that I think I was reelected, even as we started to see this swell, and different than what we were seeing in Chesa's race in San Francisco, I went to the people who were directly impacted by the system. The unpopular thing that I'll say is in these races, there's the city of Chicago and then we have the county, which is the suburbanites. And in a lot of places, suburbanites who aren't really close to these neighborhoods, who only know of these communities from that crawl or what they see, their vision of what safety looks like and policy looks very different than people who live in those neighborhoods and have been impacted. And so elected officials had been skewing their rhetoric to people who were further away from the problem. And I think what has happened with me is I've tried to be as proximate to the people who are impacted by our systems as possible. And that is it's not empathy, it's who I am.
Wes, how do those dynamics play out where you are in St. Louis County? Are you seeing similar differences between suburban and urban voters, different kinds of messaging? How do you think about those issues?
First and foremost, and I didn't shout you out, Emily. Thank you for moderating. And I'll plug the book, several books. One is Charged. Also, a new documentary coming out, Beyond Bars, on our friend Chesa. And then I'm just here as Kim's assistant, whatever she needs, water, whatever.
Carry her bag. Good.
So, there is a disconnect. And what I've found is that for years, there was not much of a spotlight on DA positions in general. No one really, particularly from the communities that were most impacted by these positions, those people seeking those positions didn't feel the need to go to North County or North City in St. Louis region or areas similar in Chicago because they didn't have to win these races. When I was running for this race on the heels of Ferguson, and my first foray into politics was as a Ferguson City Councilman. You heard of that city? Yeah? Mayor? I was elected in 2015, 9 months after Ferguson became Ferguson. And I ran because I lived in this community. I was from this community. I taught at the college in that community. I was my first job, I think like you, Chesa, we were both public defenders. And I felt that I could make a difference. And so it was tough, but we did start to right that ship and brought community policing. We brought court reforms that were so needed in that region. And so as we started to bring Ferguson off of the front page of the newspaper and off CNN for the negative stuff, we started realizing that these issues were not limited to this small, tiny suburban city called Ferguson, 19,000 people. This was something that we saw not only countywide, but nationwide, that issues that needed to be addressed. And so we had the same prosecutor who was in office for 28 years, who I had never met, and I was been in that community my entire life. And I had been, at this point, I'd been an attorney for at least 15 years, and I had never seen him other than the occasional passing by in the courtroom. And so I thought that it was important that we took our message out to those areas that were impacted by this position. So we went to North County and we explained how the criminal justice system needed to be changed, how it needed to be reformed. We talked about expanding treatment programs because I got a piece of advice a long time ago. You want to fix your criminal justice system, fix your healthcare system. There's an interconnection there between folks that are coming in the Justice Center and those struggling with substance use disorders, struggling with opioid abuse, struggling with mental health issues. You take that population, you pretty much clear out your jails. And so we started talking to folks that, hey, we're going to start addressing the underlying root causes of why these individuals are committing these crimes or ending up in the jail cell. And that resonated with folks. People recognize that, but for the grace of God, we all knew someone who just with the right push could have gone in this direction, or with the wrong nudge could have gone in the other direction. And so let's expand that tightrope and connect people to the resources that they need. And that resonated with folks. And so that's how we ran we didn't raise any money because we were running against a 30-year incumbent. There were no commercials. You go on Facebook, you can find everything that we did because that's all we could afford to do. But it worked. And we not only won against a 30-year incumbent, we won by 14 points. And I think it starts with not conceding those folks that are used to not being heard and not given a voice. You got to go talk to them because those folks came out in numbers that were overwhelming to support us. And I think that's how we have to approach. I think that's what being an elected official should be about.
So the fact that there are more prosecutors subscribing to this kind of message suggests that there is a growing interest in this and real capacity for success. However, it is not always a successful situation. And Chesa, one of the things that struck me in the recall campaign in San Francisco was that you ran into the limits of the power of the district attorney. We think of those officials as having a lot of say-so, but you can't actually control the health system. You can talk about fixing it, but that's not something you actually can do yourself. And I think one dynamic that seemed very present was that there were these concerns that city residents had about disorder, for example, that were not things that involved crimes, that you were actually, it was necessarily in your purview, and yet there you were, the public official who was being harangued every night on Fox News and wherever else, and blamed for those issues. And I wonder how you think about that challenge, because it's obviously really important to talk about the health system and root causes, and yet there also is a way in which, like, you're not the mayor or the governor. You have this particular purview.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on a really important tension in not just the dynamic that I've confronted, but also that I think many people who run for and win the office of district attorney on a reform platform have to navigate. Because on the one hand, as Wesley said, San Francisco's county jail is the #1 service provider for mental health services in our county. That's true in most big cities. That's not unique to San Francisco. Anybody who thinks that's working is crazy. They're the ones who need the mental health, right? It's not cost effective, it's not humane, it certainly isn't curing people's mental illness, it's not keeping us safe, it guarantees that we wait until somebody causes harm to a victim before we intervene. Like, who thinks that's a good idea? And yet that's what we're doing in every big city in America. So absolutely, if we are people of conscience, if we are people who lead with empathy and humanity, as Kim talked about, if we're looking at data and facts, as Wesley's urging us to and as we must, then we have to get up on the soapbox that being a political candidate or an office holder affords us and say to people, let's address root causes. And yet, by doing that, we often end up owning problems that we are not responsible for, that we don't have a mandate or a budget to fix. I confronted that every day. San Francisco right now is appealing to the Trump-controlled U.S. Supreme Court to allow local government officials to criminalize homelessness. They literally are asking the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal decision that says it is cruel and unusual to destroy people's tents or criminally prosecute them for setting up a tent on public property unless you first provide them with a shelter bed. You can do it all you want if there's a shelter bed they can go to. San Francisco doesn't want to build shelter beds, and it wants to destroy people's property and homes and make them move without building shelter beds. It's inhumane, it's bad policy, it's unconstitutional, and they're asking the Trump Supreme Court to give them the leeway to do it. When I was the district attorney of San Francisco, people blamed me for homelessness. And I would say, well, we have a Department of Housing with a budget that's about 10 times my budget. I can't build housing. What I can do is say that putting homeless people in jails is not a good idea and is illegal. I would rather prosecute murders and rapes. That's a better use of our courtrooms. That's a better use of the resources of my assistant district attorneys. That's a better way that I can advocate for public safety. I want to just tell one other story, because I grew up, as I said, in this neighborhood. And when I was a kid, we were on 48th Street. Not too far from here, but a very different neighborhood. And I played in a baseball league, the Hyde Park Kenwood Baseball League. And I wasn't very good, but I played year after year after year. And I remember one year I was on the Pee Wee League team, the White Sox, and we were having a game. It was middle of summer, it was hot. There was hot, heavy Chicago summer days. And there was a drive-by shooting in the park at the basketball court. Somebody came out on a bicycle and did a drive-by shooting. And I remember the coaches yelling, get under the bench and, get on the ground. It was scary. I was like 10 years old. It was really scary. Everybody was scared. The parents were scared. Somebody got hit. We didn't know who, somebody on the basketball court. This was back in those years that Kim was talking about when we had 800-900 homicides every year in Chicago. And the city's response to that shooting was to take down the basketball hoops. Take down the basketball hoops. That doesn't make us safe. They haven't put them back. Like, we need outdoor spaces where people, especially people living in poverty, especially people who've been cooped up inside in cold winters like this one, can get outside and do exercise and be inspired by Michael Jordan, right? Like, we need that. And if our response to everything that goes wrong is collective punishment of our most marginalized communities, we are not solving these problems, we're making them worse. So yeah, there's a real contradiction for progressive prosecutors because it's not our job to put up basketball hoops, but we damn well better fight for them.
Wes, I know you want to jump
And I wanted to add on to that point because I think that everything that we've talked about is through a lens of winning and losing, potentially losing your position. And I think that to serve in these spaces, you have to be willing to lose. You have to be willing to say, I believe in what I'm doing. I believe that these policies are helpful and beneficial to my community. That, yeah, I may lose. These positions are temporary. We're just caretakers for these positions, and I think we all recognize that, and we all have to be willing to walk away or be sent away because one of the two things are going to happen at some point. But to know that we stood on what was right, we can walk away and look in the mirror knowing that we did what was right for our community, what was right for an underserved population that has no one to speak for. And I commend people like Chesa, who was willing to stand on his integrity. Kim, who said, you know what, I'm just going to head out. And so many others who do the right thing for the right reasons. And I'm just proud to be amongst them.
So the country went through a rise in crime that was real in a lot of places during COVID. We could talk for a long time about the causes. And now crime is dropping to a remarkable degree, again, in most of the country. I'm not sure you can credit the policies of progressive prosecutors for that drop in the same way that it was pretty clear because the rise was uniform, that policies like the ones you all have promoted, weren't to blame. But one thing that's really striking to me about this drop is that people don't see it that way. When people are polled and asked about crime, they say that it is rising, even in places where that's really not true. And it seems to maybe have something to do with their local situation, but not really. I wonder why you think that is. It seems like an extremely frustrating and limiting factor in reform. And I also feel like I should let you all talk about the role of the media, invite you all to talk about the role of the media in this, because I think it's something that some outlets obviously exploit crime all the time. When I was growing up in Philadelphia, my mom used to call the evening news the knife and gun club because it's just really easy to roll up with the camera and show the red light spinning and have the statistic about crime instead of really covering people's lives and how that happened and what that means for the people who are affected. But I think other reporters want to do a good job covering this issue, and yet every time we focus on a homicide or a shooting, we risk kind of stoking these fears people have. And I just wonder how you all think about that as public officials who I'm sure had your shares of run-ins with the media for good and ill at this point. You want to start?
Who, me?
Sure.
Look, I think there's the traditional media that many of us grew up on. We used to have 2, 5, 7, 9, 32. We had 5 choices that we can choose from, and then we had national news that would run 24/7. And today we have Facebook and Facebook neighborhood groups. We have the Ring app group. We have like all of these things, because I get alerts about coyotes and like carjackings, like actual coyotes. But it feels ever present when you get an alert on your phone from your neighborhood group that someone just got robbed. It feels ever present. Like, it is not even just that I have to wait till 6 o'clock. We have on our bodies things that are telling us continuously that we are not safe. Like, that is a very real challenge. And then the conversations in the neighborhood groups about what is happening or what's not happening has changed the tenor of the community meetings that you're talking about, because it feels hyper local. And so even if one person got robbed in that building, and that's the only robbery on that block, it's hyper local. It feels like you can touch it. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that. And so to the point that Chesa made earlier, that even as we see a drop in crime, if I just got that alert that my neighbor had her car stolen or someone was carjacked, I don't care about those numbers. That feels very present to me. And it doesn't matter that you saw violence 20 years ago that was higher than this. No one should live in fear. So let's start there. I think from the media in Chicago, I can speak, or Cook County, it's an interesting place. So it's a fascinating place. I think I've seen a change. A few years ago, we had a police superintendent who would just go on television and just say stuff. He just would, he would just say stuff that was not factually accurate. And then what would happen is he would say something that was not factually accurate, and then they would say, State's Attorney Foxx, respond to that. And so then it was, well, that's not accurate. And then the media would say, they're pointing fingers. And so I had to learn, I'm not going to engage in that. I'm going to do the things that require extra work. We'll do media, come to the office, we will show you our data, we will walk through it, we will do an education. And then I started to see the press here, some outlets, not all, start saying when he would say something that wasn't accurate, that would say without basis or without merit. He has said without merit. So basically, it was fact checking that was starting to happen. Same thing around the issues of wrongful convictions. We've done a lot of work in the last several years on wrongful convictions. And in the beginning, there's a lot of skepticism about it, right? People believe, well, they must have done something. There was this inherent disbelief that someone would go to jail for a crime that they didn't commit, or someone would confess to a crime that they didn't commit. I've watched the trajectory of those conversations around wrongful convictions change in the last 7 years related to this work, that it is not discounted. It is a narrative that we're talking about more, and even as it relates to police or prosecutorial misconduct, that those don't feel so much like outlier conversations. And so I think we're dealing with a media landscape that understands people's fear, and people are gonna turn on to see where the thing happened so they know where to move or go. And people in a landscape that exploits personalities. Right? It's an easier, sexier story to say that the police superintendent and the state's attorney are in conflict, or the mayor and the state's attorney are in conflict, because people like a good conflict, but it doesn't make us safer. And so I think I have no criticism of the media other than, they keep asking me about one case. I'll let you guess, but
it's a mystery.
And it only bothers me because it takes away from the thousands of other cases that we should be talking about. And I think the sensationalism around that, I don't take it personally, I get the interest, but the sensationalism around one celebrity case, that from someone who didn't go to jail, discounts the fact that there were over 200 plus men and women whose convictions were vacated because of a system failure. And if we don't spend enough time and energy and ink talking about that, and more time talking about one celebrity, we will find ourselves back in this trap.
Can I just build on some of what Kim said? I mean, first of all, the point that you're making, Emily, about the disconnect between the way people feel and data is not new. It's not unique to the progressive prosecutor movement. That goes back 20, 30 years. And as crime rates have fallen in this country, across the country, in the broad arc of history, polling shows that people consistently think crime is going up. And it's not limited to public safety. Paul Krugman had an article in the New York Times, what was it, a month or two ago, about the same disconnect between data and feeling around the economy. So this is a broader phenomenon that I think all of us who are committed to democracy, regardless of our views on particular issues, need to be really, really hyper aware of. You know, Kim talked about Nextdoor and Ring and Facebook, all of that stuff, right? All of the ways in which we are increasingly bombarded with real-time information. Compounded with the prevalence of video cameras everywhere, right? It used to be that if, like that shooting I described, you know, in Shoesmith Park, it might have made the news, somebody might have seen it, you know, on Channel 5, but realistically, most people probably weren't going to hear about that. And now everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody's got a camera, surveillance camera on their doorbell or on their car, and so even if crime is falling by 20% the way it did in San Francisco, we're seeing an inverse and totally uncorrelated exponential increase in the number of videos and photos of criminal activity. Broken glass, assaults, fights, homeless people on the street, whatever it is. The data doesn't matter because people see it over and over and over again in their feed. And you try telling somebody who saw broken glass on their street and who's seen a dozen videos or gotten Ring alerts about robberies, you try telling them that crime is down and showing them data. And you know what they do? What they did in San Francisco? They say that's just because people gave up reporting it. I don't trust the numbers. Like those of us that are critical of Donald Trump and his very loose relationship with the facts need to be really aware of the fact that this happens to us too, on all sides of every political issue. People no longer care about data, they care about how they feel. And that is a very dangerous place from which to cast votes. It is an even more dangerous place from which to make public policy when it comes to something as critical as the safety of our communities.
And I would say first and foremost, is there any media here? Because I have nothing bad to say about media. We've got a great relationship and I need to keep it that way. But in all seriousness, obviously, as we've all heard, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And that's a business. It's a for-profit business. And so I'm not going to question what they run and what they don't run. Although, you know, that obviously contributes to some of the misconceptions that we get around crime. But I'll also add the social media aspect of it. And to Kim's point, and even Chesa's point, everything is personalized now, and everyone has a platform to talk about how they feel. And that does make a difference when you get on social media or you get on those neighborhood apps and you see someone say, someone broke in my house, and then it gets retweeted or what have you, and it does feel more personal. Then you have an influx of guns. And as we've seen crime go down, the use of guns in those crimes has gone up. So what used to be a smash and grab, at least in the St. Louis region, car break-in, no one was hurt, no one was around. Well, now a lot of these folks have guns because in Missouri, our legislators have decided that you're breathing, you should have a gun. And it hasn't helped at all, obviously. And so I think that there are things that lend to that idea that crime is going up. And I think he said exactly what I was thinking, is that research shows that people always believe that, regardless. But I do think with the advent of social media and the polarization of our politics, everyone now has picked a side as opposed to hearing the issue before you decide what you're going to do. I think that lends itself to looking for fingers to point and people to blame, as Kim talked about.
So I want to move to audience questions. As was said previously, we're going to give priority for the first few questions to students. And to everyone who asks a question, I have a small plea. I hate interrupting people. It's my weakness as a moderator. I'll do it if I have to, but you could save me from this by not going on too long and making a long statement rather than asking a question. So thank you in advance for that consideration. I will appreciate it. And now I can't actually see well enough. Oh, there's the
roving mic.
person with the mic. Excellent, thank you.
We have mics on both sides of the rooms, by the way, both sides of the room, so.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Manley. I'm a fourth year in the college, studying public policy and critical race and ethnic studies. A question that I've asked pretty much every prosecutor I've ever gotten to talk to is, what advice do you have for students or folks who are interested in reforming or changing the criminal legal system, but here, like, once you're on the other side, once you're on the prosecutor side, like, you get swept up, like, you can't make real change, like, this system is already the way it is, like, at the end of the day, you still have to prosecute people and put people in jail, and, like, there's only so much you can do, because I think I go back and forth on that a lot personally, and I'm curious what you guys have to say about it.
That is a great question to start out with.
I'll just say, I know Wes and I both have practiced law on both sides of the aisle. And I loved my time as a public defender. I had a chance to talk with some law students about it earlier today. It's a great, honorable profession. Being a prosecutor, just like being a public defender, is not for everybody. And I think the challenge that all of us have in life, especially those of you that are students and still have, many, many more years ahead of you, is to figure out what your role is. There's not a right or a wrong role. Right? We all have a unique fingerprint, and we've got to figure out where our fingerprint plugs in to the challenges and the opportunities in the world around us. And so if you're the kind of person who could, no matter, maybe you're an abolitionist, but you could never stand up in court next to somebody who you knew had raped a child and defend them and argue for their release on a technicality, then you probably shouldn't be a public defender. And if you're the kind of person who could never ask for that person to be behind bars, then you probably shouldn't be a prosecutor. There is room in this movement. And in fact, if we are going to be successful in building the kind of world that we deserve, the kind of community that we want to raise our families in, then we need to have people of conscience on both sides of the aisle. And the notion that you cannot achieve meaningful change by being a prosecutor is so easy to disprove, because all you have to do is look at the people sitting to my left and to my right.
And I'll add to that. And what's your name, ma'am?
Hi, Natalie.
Natalie? Two quick points, Natalie, that I think that anyone in your position needs to think about is that these decisions are being made, and someone's going to make them. Mm-hmm. And if you want to leave that to the chance of someone who doesn't care about your interests or care about the folks that are on the other end of those prosecutorial decisions, then to Chesa's point, then that's a decision that has to be made. But the bottom line is, what I do not regret 1 second of my time as a public defender. I wanted to make certain that everyone had had quality representation, and I was born in Alton, Illinois, so actually in this state, and I grew up, most of my time growing up until probably as a teenager, we're in the projects at Oakwood housing projects and Alton Acre housing projects. And everyone I knew that had any interaction with the criminal justice system was on the business end. And I didn't know any lawyers until I pretty much was a lawyer for that matter. And so everyone that I came across told me they were innocent, so I thought everybody was innocent. Now, as I start realizing that wasn't necessarily true in every case, I started realizing that I can help one individual at a time as a public defender or as a defense attorney, or I can help hundreds or thousands of people with the stroke of a pen as a prosecutor. Our policies have changed the game for a lot of folks who would have seen the inside of a jail cell but didn't, and got the help that they needed. And I'm proud of that work as well. So I'll wrap that up by agreeing with Chesa. You need good people on all sides, and you got to find your space. But I would think about those things as you navigate this decision, if you will.
I'm gonna make a pitch for you to come work for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. I've never worked on the other side. I appreciate that we absolutely, in order to have a full, healthy, functioning criminal legal system needs strong public defense and defense attorneys and prosecutors. Let me say this. Well, I say this to when we swear people into our office. You take the oath to become a lawyer in Illinois. You take a secondary oath to become a prosecutor. We're the only parts of the system that requires a secondary oath. And I mention that because a lot of people in the media are like, oh, she talks about defendants. We take the oath. The oath in Cook County is to uphold the United States Constitution and the Illinois Constitution. The rules of professional conduct for lawyers, we have rules of professional conduct for lawyers. There's a special section for prosecutors. And in that section, it delineates who we represent. The people of the state of Illinois, including the interest of the defense. Now, people don't know that, and I feel like I got to slow that down. If there's press here, I'm gonna slow it down, because a lot of the tension that I get is like, oh, she cares about defendants. We had a criminal legal system here in Cook County where I get where people have trepidation, where people were literally having electrodes placed on their genitalia, and prosecutors who saw the scars. That when we talk about John Birch, when we talk about this history that predates my time in office, there were prosecutors who could have stood on the front lines and said, we're not going to do that. Who have an extra special oath. And so we have the ability. It's a privilege to serve in a role where you represent the people. And absolutely, there are things that, that the system and any bureaucracy comes with that poses a challenge. I believe that there are people who need to be separated from the rest of us if they commit egregious harms. I also believe that we've separated far too many people from us because they have been poor or mentally ill or struggled with a myriad of issues that could be resolved outside of the system. And so I think you can hold both truths. You can hold both truths. Some people need to be prosecuted and incarcerated. That's a fact. I say that as someone who has been hurt and harmed, and I know that incarceration doesn't heal the harm for me, but there's some people who need to be separated. I think what has happened in our system is that we have lost our sense of who those people are. I would imagine that it is a much smaller population than we've allowed ourselves to let happen. But if we don't have strong prosecutors, I mean, we're the most powerful, I believe, the most powerful actors in this system. The prosecutor. You don't get before a judge unless a prosecutor charges you. You don't get before a judge unless a prosecutor charges you. And the last thing I will say on that, when we talk about policies, we talked about the abolition of cash bail. I pushed for this with advocates and activists and the public defender and others for years. 68 prosecutors in this state filed a lawsuit to stop that from happening. And they went on TV and they fear-mongered and they said we were going to have the purge. You remember that? Where everybody was prepping for the purge? Did you go get your water ready? It didn't happen. Our jail population has dropped by almost 20%. People are returning to court. But it was the validation of having a prosecutor advocate for these issues that saw substantial change. And I would dare say, I don't like the hero complex that like the movement gets. Like, we don't do this alone. When we do it in concert with those who are closest to the ground, the activists, and advocates and policymakers, the presence of a prosecutor can make substantial changes. The reason we had the 1994 crime bill, the reason we had the draconian penalties from the 80s and 90s, those were prosecutors. Going down to Springfield, going down to their state houses, asking for more and more and more and more penalties. Our way out of this will be having more prosecutors going down to Springfield and asking for more and more and more reform.
Questions from students on this side?
Yes.
Students on this side.
Good evening. My name is Christian Piercanel. I'm a third year at the law school. You've all discussed one way or another the relationship between the voters, the electorate, and your responsibility as prosecutors and the trust. But clearly there's been recent pressures or attacks on not just civil rights, but as well as voting. And very often, a lot of the people that we have been discussing today are also the ones who are least likely to play a role in the political movement. Can you all discuss whether you feel that there's a responsibility or what ways, as prosecutors, you can alleviate some of those pressures against people being a part of their civic duty to vote?
Civil rights and voting issues.
I'll quickly say, Ron DeSantis, he wears lifts in his shoes, but also he stripped Andrew Warren, who was the duly elected prosecutor, from his seat almost 2 years ago.
Miami, I think.
Not Miami, Tampa.
Tampa.
And then a year after that, he stripped Monique Worrell, who was the duly elected prosecutor, out of Orlando for saying that she wouldn't prosecute cases of abortion. Now, those are prosecutors and those folks who would be considered to be reform-minded prosecutors, but that's also, I'm watching this movement and the challenges that we are facing and the intersection of democracy. Duly elected people being stripped of their power because people don't like what they're doing, and the impact on those communities. And we talked a lot about marginalized communities who now have shown up to vote in these races and said we want reform, and then others saying, well, actually we don't want that. And so now we're trying to circumvent ways for people to hold those seats. So you have a governor who can strip. You have a recall campaign as it relates to Chesa. Here in Illinois, there was a downstate legislator who proposed legislation for recall of prosecutors in counties of more than 2 million people.
There are lots of those
Who are they
counties
talking
in
about?
Illinois.
There's but one. And so we're watching the perversion of our democracy and its practices collide with this era of reform. And so we are having to be mindful to talk about that it's not just voting in these elections, or we have an election coming up for a state's attorney in March. It's critically important that we engage not just at the presidential, but what it means here, locally, in that intersection. And so we have seen it. There's been a coalition of prosecutors across the country who've tried to give rise to our democracy is in trouble right now. It just is. And that's not me picking a candidate on the national stage. We are watching ways to circumvent the due elections of folks, and particularly in these roles, have been fraught. I mean, I asked Chesa about a couple of our colleagues in California who are also now subjected to recall campaigns or threats of recall. And how does one even work? How do you even do your job if you are constantly worried about being recalled?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. They don't want you to do your job. DA Gascon in Los Angeles, the biggest jurisdiction any prosecutor in the country is in charge of, they tried to recall him literally within a couple of months of his inauguration, and it turned out they had filed the paperwork too early, and local rules didn't even allow them to initiate the recall. So they tried again a couple months later. That recall failed. They tried again. They spent more than $10 million paying people to gather signatures. They still failed. I think we could pick examples like Kim did from Florida. We could look at what they did to Larry in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, where I'm going to tell the example because it's so crazy. The Republican-controlled House in the state legislature in Pennsylvania decided to impeach Larry Krasner because they didn't like his policies. Policies which, by the way, like Kim, had been voted on, wasn't anointed, wasn't a dictator. He had been elected not once but twice with an overwhelming majority of votes and was doing what he had promised voters he would do, like it or not. Well, the Republicans in the House didn't like it, so they voted to impeach him. You know who they didn't vote to impeach? Another elected district attorney in a different part of the state who happened to be Republican, who was facing criminal prosecution for rape while he was in office. That guy wasn't worthy of impeachment. But Larry Krasner, doing what he told voters to do, was worthy of all the time and energy and political hullabaloo of an impeachment. Now, what's the connection between the question that was asked by the law student in the front row over there and the impeachments and the summary removals from office and all of the recall efforts? The connection is there's a lot of people in this country who were denied the right to vote for generations, who fought and died to win that right. And many of us in this room, and in our communities have fought like heck to get those communities to appreciate and value and take advantage of the right to vote, because they've been taught, and it has been beaten literally into them, not to vote and not to value the right to vote, and that it doesn't matter. And you know what teaches people who showed up to vote, maybe for the first time ever, for a state's attorney, when they cast their ballot for State's Attorney Kim Foxx, what teaches those folks not to bother, not to come back and keep voting, is when she gets recalled 3 months into her election, into her tenure. Or when she gets summarily removed from office because the Republican governor doesn't like her. So if we care about the right to vote, it's not enough to litigate the cases in front of the Supreme Court or to push back on the ways they're trying to initiate new poll taxes or literacy tests, right? That's all important. But we also need to defend the outcomes of election. That's right. We have 4-year terms for a reason in this country, because we expect that it takes time. Well, he's going to have a 2-year term soon, but it takes time to get the job done. And we cannot fairly or critically evaluate people if we don't give them that time. And we want them to do the job they were elected to do, not to spend all of their time campaigning. And so I think it's a very, very real threat to democracy when we have all of these different mechanisms, which, by the way, are not pushback from the bottom. This is not voters saying we are unhappy with what you are doing.
That's right.
Progressive prosecutors are overwhelmingly reelected when they have a head-to-head against somebody the way Kim and Larry did. Where we lose is in situations like the one they fabricated with $10 million of political money in San Francisco, where they create a special election where you're not running against anybody else. You're running against yourself. How would Joe Biden do if he was running against himself today? He'll probably win because he's running against Donald Trump. There are a lot of people who would not vote for him if he were running against himself, who would happily vote to recall him, but who will donate money and get their friends and families to go to the polls because they're terrified of what the other candidate looks like and will do.
I just want to add another thing to look out for, I think, in 2024, which is prosecutors, not the folks on this stage, who start task forces to investigate voter fraud, or in other ways get the word out that if you vote and you weren't allowed to be on the rolls, you could get in big trouble. That's a way in which prosecutors can be directly involved in really preventing people from voting, which I think is one of the concerns you were raising. There's a question over here.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Christian. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the Harris School. And my question concerns the fact that you all are in a very interesting environment where where you are elected officials, but you also are in the legal profession. So my question is, how do you deal with other people within your own political apparatus, say a mayor, a governor, who may not agree with you or agree with your policies? And how do you kind of like keep your faith, keep your momentum, your spirit when someone might be actively clashing against you, plotting against you? Or have there been experiences where someone actually has been helpful and has helped you along the way?
Y'all trying to trap me.
I do feel like they're trying to get you.
Yeah, listen, I'm on my third mayor. When I came into office, Mayor Emanuel was in office, and we had Lori Lightfoot, and now I'm on Mayor Brandon Johnson. A healthy city, county, community requires us all to work together. And I have found that when we are committed to doing that, that good things can happen. Like, there are resources at the county, city, state level that, as we talked about, what we need to really address root causes, that we need to marshal together. Some of my biggest challenges have been, and I think it, again, is around politics, right? People want an answer. I don't feel safe, give me an answer. And you have to be strong enough to say, sometimes we don't have an answer. Or you can say, it's Kim Foxx's fault. Over and over and over again.
Or number one.
Over and over. And that's easy, because then it's like, well, then I'll shift my gaze over here. And that makes it really fraught. And so I really have here, to not get engaged in those types of public fights, because what ends up happening are the people who live in the neighborhoods, who don't believe in government, who don't believe that the systems are here to help them, will give up. It is another way to disenfranchise people, is when they see their elected leaders who are supposed to work together do that. And so it's a challenge, because there's so many things, as Chesa said earlier, are outside of our control. I don't control housing. I don't control, the mental health clinics. I don't control these things. and people sit in silos. And so what we've tried to do is engage around how that works, how that happens, so that we can be a complement to one another. And so I will say it's been a very different time in this current administration to come to the table and not feel defensive, not worry about, is this a conversation that's somehow going to be, pitting people against one another. It's never been how I've operated. I've always been asked to respond to stuff. You never see me punch first, because I don't think it serves our public to do that.
Agreed.
Where is the mic? The mic coming.
Hi, my name is James Jimmy Soto. I am an example of the progressive prosecutors that we have. Kimberly Foxx, she recently granted my release and dismissal of my charges after 42 years of wrongful incarceration. My question is, what's up, Bill? I see you. I just like to say that, what you've done for me and for others, it's just, we can't express in words how thankful I am, my family, etc. But my question is, how can we continue this? What can we do? You're going to be leaving office. What can we do to ensure that there will be more swift and fast review of wrongful convictions? What can we do? I know that you've relabeled your conviction integrity unit to conviction review unit. What can we do to ensure that wrongful convictions don't have to linger 42 years?
Well,
Thank you for that question.
thank you. It's a privilege to see you, Jimmy. He's the longest serving person who had his conviction exonerated, 42 years. Let that sit. Yes. Jimmy, we got a lot of work to do. What we've tried to do in the course of the last 7 years is one, give credibility to this work. I think people take for granted, Cook County Illinois has led the nation 5 out of the last 6 years in the vacation of wrongful convictions, when we were once dubbed the false confession capital of the United States. And so we tried to build this from scratch, learning along the way. And then people started overwhelming us with requests to look at their cases. So we got the conviction review work, we got the post-conviction work, and we have an office that is big, but the staff dedicated to this relative to the need has been small. So I think part of this is we need a statewide commission on wrongful convictions, that we need to have folks outside of these organizations. There are challenges within my organization to doing this work. Not everybody is aligned with the work that I'm doing who works for me. Back to Natalie's point. But we need to elect people in this role who care about this work. And I'm not trying to get political. We're the Institute of Politics. There's a race. And I think people's histories as former prosecutors, wrongfully convicting children, talking about super predators, is stuff that we don't leave in the past. But I think we have to have a statewide commission on wrongful convictions. If we've done all of this in Cook County, we don't see nearly anything coming out of DuPage or Will or LaSalle or St. Clair, and you can't tell me that that's not happening.
Last question, I think. Somebody, sorry.
Hello. My name is Ayman, and I'm a student at the Public Policy School, second-year MPP student. And so we know about the importance of root causes to complex problems, but these are long-term solutions that can often take years. So my question is, what are some short-term solutions or measures progressive prosecutors can take which can maybe help counter perceptions of higher crime and all that we hear in the media?
The long-term solutions, no one's done them. I'm gonna shut up after this. People keep saying that. I go to forums and they're like, these are long-term solutions. Where's been the investment in the long-term solution? What we have done is a lot of acute stuff, right? 3 strikes rules, higher penalties, penalty enhancements. and no investment in long-term solutions. So I will just say it at that yes, it takes years, but I would beg the question, why are there no basketball hoops in the park that Chesa talked about when he played? That's a simple one.
One way to think about this question, though, is that voters often want short term. They want an answer right now. And so when you talk about root causes, they can see that as not responsive. So I think that...
No, I get it. But I think that's why I say some of it has been short-term solutions, which are penalty enhancements. A terrible thing happens, we go down to our state houses and name a bill after the terrible thing that happened to a person. We have to do both. We have to do both. But some of it is, again, we have short-term solutions that don't feel, because it doesn't feel like it's enough, and we ignore the long-term solutions. And I feel compelled to say that because I hear it a lot, and I see the same neighborhoods that have the same burnout because we say it's coming, and we don't invest with the same level of urgency than we do for an acute short-term.
And I know we're out of time, and I want to give Wesley the last word to actually answer your question, but I want to just pile on here a little bit and say it took generations to build up the failings of the system that we all stepped into the fray to try to fix. Right? The system of mass incarceration didn't come out of nowhere. That wasn't short-term. It was a lot of short-term policies with decades of investment in building jails and prisons, and decades of underinvestment in building basketball hoops and housing and mental health facilities. So the idea that, Wesley Bell can get elected and snap his fingers and overnight fix problems that were literally generations in the making, that's not realistic. And we need to be able to do the long-term work, or we will not fix the problems that have been built up over the long term. And with that,
what's your productive short-term solution?
There you go. There you go. Solve all our problems.
I think that part of the answer to your question is prosecutors do have to do a better job, in my opinion, of getting the narrative out of what we're doing. Our office had never had a community engagement unit until I implemented one, and I watched folks like Kim Foxx and others. I stole that idea from several of them. And so, matter of fact, my first community engagement officer, I believe, is in this room. Captain Farmer, are you around? Okay, there he is over there. That was our first community engagement. And we were doing work like this before I got in, so we continue doing this work. We hosted a shoot or don't shoot simulator that we worked with the police department that let us use it. We hosted town halls every single month to talk about the things that we were doing. And I think that those are some of the things that resonate with voters, because I think we've already talked about the short-term and long-term solutions, and whatever lens you want to look through them through, we've talked about those things, and some of them are beyond us. They're more upstream than we are. We don't have it in our budgets to be able to invest in early childhood care, right? Which is a long-term solution. But we can talk about the things that we do. And the last thing I want to talk about, or mention, and I'll be brief, is shortly after I was elected, a noted author came to speak to our office, Emily Bazelon.
Yes. Uh-oh.
And I wanted to bring her there because I had heard her speak and I had heard her talk about some of the issues that my office, which was brand new to me, and they were pretty much steeped in the tough on crime policies, if that is a policy. And one of the issues that came up, one of my prosecutors, who I now list as a convert, and Emily, you may remember this, she said, well, it sounds like most of the policies that you're talking about only impact defendants. Why are we talking about the victims? And so I asked her, I want you to look at your case files, and I want you to look at the victims, and then I want you to cross-reference that with the defendants. We're talking about the same group of folks. These same group of folks are more likely to be victims and defendants. So when you are implementing these policies that help even defendants, you are helping victims. you are helping people that are in the most critical need of those folks that we want to help, even though sometimes defendants, we don't want to help them as a society. But just rewrite the meaning and the definition, and we'll be helping our victims as well. And I think that if we start looking at it through the lens of what is best for our community, I think we'll get closer to the long-term and the short-term solutions.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Senator Thomas. Thank you all. Thank